Nobody had expected Lord Darnwell to marry Susannah Grey. This was not a secret. It was said openly, in the drawing rooms and the morning calls and the careful social conversation of 3 counties, with the particular frank bewilderment that polite society permits itself when the subject of the bewilderment is not present and not likely to be. Lord Darnwell was 34, wealthy, titled, possessed of an estate of 11,000 acres and a townhouse in the better part of London, and had been, since the death of his father 3 years before, the most eligible man in the county by every measure that mattered to the people who kept these measures. He could have married anyone. Susannah Grey was 26, which society had decided was the far side of eligible. She was the daughter of the Reverend Grey of Hartwell, a small living in the next county, a kind and impractical man who had spent his adult life reading theology and improving the drainage of his churchyard, and who had left his daughter, on his death the previous winter, with a sum of money that was sufficient for 2 years of careful living, and not sufficient for anything more ambitious than that. She had been teaching at the small school in the village for 3 years before her father's death, and had continued to teach at it after, because teaching paid a small wage and small wages were better than nothing, and because she was, whatever else she was or was not, practical. She was also, in the view of those qualified to assess these things, not particularly beautiful. She was what the generous called handsome and the less generous called plain, and what she herself called, on the occasions when the subject arose, entirely beside the point. She read too many books. She had opinions on subjects that women of her station were not generally expected to have opinions on, and she had the further disadvantage of expressing those opinions in company rather than keeping them private, which was the kind of social miscalculation that was generally attributed to a lack of proper feminine restraint, and that Susannah had long since stopped trying to correct, because she had found the correction more exhausting than the consequences. Lord Darnwell had called on Reverend Grey twice in the 3 months before the Reverend's death, on matters related to the living's historical records, which Darnwell Park had some interest in. He had spoken with Susannah on both visits, briefly, on topics ranging from the drainage of the churchyard, which she had opinions on, to the translation question in the library's older theology volumes, which she also had opinions on. He had listened to the opinions with an attention she had not expected and had not initially trusted, because the attention of a wealthy and important man given to an unimportant woman's opinions on translation methodology was the kind of thing that turned out, in Susannah's experience, to be something other than what it appeared. It appeared to be genuine interest. It continued to appear this way across 2 visits. She remained appropriately sceptical. 3 weeks after her father's death, Lord Darnwell had called on Susannah at the small house she had moved to in Hartwell village, and had proposed marriage. He had been direct about it in a way that she found either admirable or alarming, depending on which part of the conversation she was replaying in her memory. He had said that he had a practical reason for the marriage that he would explain to her in due course when he was able to, and that he understood this was an unusual thing to say and an unusual basis for a proposal, and that he was not asking her to trust him blindly, but rather to believe that he was not a dishonest man, and that the practical reason was not a shameful one, merely a complicated one. He had said that Darnwell Park was a fine house with an excellent library, and that she would have full use of both. He had said she would be treated with every respect due her position. He had said he believed they could make a practical success of the arrangement if she was willing to approach it practically. She had asked him several direct questions. He had answered all of them directly. She had then asked him one further question, which was whether the practical reason he mentioned involved harming her in any way. He had said, with something in his face that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, that it did not. She had said she would think about it. She had thought about it for 4 days, during which she had assessed her situation with the clear-eyed accuracy of a woman who had been assessing her situation without sentiment for some time. She was 26, with 2 years' worth of funds and a teacher's small wage and no immediate prospect of anything better. She was not in love with Lord Darnwell, but she was not in love with him either. She had spent, in total, perhaps 3 hours in his company across 2 visits and 1 proposal, which was not enough time for any strong feeling in either direction. He was intelligent, which she valued. He was direct, which she valued more. He had listened to her opinions on translation methodology, which was the kind of thing that accumulated in a woman's assessment of a man, whether she intended it to or not. She said yes. The wedding was small and correct, and produced no tears from either party, which was reported in the local correspondence with mild surprise and mild admiration in approximately equal measure. The journey to Darnwell Park was long. Lord Darnwell, she had begun to think of him as Oliver in her own mind, though she had not yet used the name aloud, because using a man's given name felt like a declaration of something she was not yet certain she was prepared to declare, sat across from her in the carriage, and was courteous and informative about the estate's geography and management as they approached. He was not cold, exactly. He was at a certain carefully maintained distance, and the distance was not unkind, merely present, and she respected the honesty of it even while she noted its existence. She arrived at Darnwell Park on an October evening in failing light, and formed her first impression of the house in the grey of a Yorkshire autumn dusk. It was, as promised, a fine house, Georgian, grey stone, well-proportioned, with a long south facade and the grounds that 11,000 acres produced when properly managed. The east end of the house had a tower, a square stone tower that predated the Georgian main block by perhaps 2 centuries, incorporated into the later building in the way that older structures sometimes were, standing slightly proud of the main facade and slightly separate from it in character. The tower had 1 window that she could see from the drive. The window was dark. She noted this and moved on. Mrs. Farrow, the housekeeper, received them with composed professional warmth. Susannah was shown to her rooms. Oliver said good night at the connecting door in the correct manner. She was alone in the rooms that were now hers, in the house that was now hers, in the marriage that was now hers, and she was, on the whole, determined to make something of all 3. She began with the library. She had been promised the library and she intended to use it, and using it turned out to be one of the more straightforward pleasures of her new situation. Darnwell Park's library was precisely what a library ought to be, extensive, well-organized, with the good old volumes that indicated genuine rather than decorative collecting, and with the pleasant dusty smell of a room that had been used for reading rather than displaying. She spent the first morning in it, cataloguing what it held and making a provisional list of what it lacked, and when Oliver found her there at 11 o'clock, she was on her knees before the lower shelves with a notebook and a pencil, and the particular expression of absorption that a very good library produces in a person who loves books. He looked at her for a moment. She looked up. "Good morning," she said, with the composure of someone who has been caught doing nothing at all embarrassing. "Your 17th century theology section is incomplete. You have the Stillingfleet and the Pearson but not the Barrow, and without the Barrow the argument for the other 2 is rather hanging in the air." He said, "I was not aware of that. Most people are not. It requires a particular kind of attention to notice." There was a brief pause. "I will have Barrow located," he said. "Thank you," she said, and returned to her notebook. He stayed, which surprised her. He came to the reading table and picked up a volume she had set aside in the course of her cataloguing, and examined it briefly, and then he sat in the other chair at the table and read it for half an hour while she continued her survey of the lower shelves. It was, she thought afterward, the most companionable half-hour of her marriage so far, and it had not required either of them to do anything except be in the same room with a book. At the end of the half-hour, he said that he would be in his estate office through the afternoon if she had any questions about the household arrangements, and he left. She spent the afternoon reading the estate accounts. This was not, technically, within her immediate brief, but she was a practical woman, and a practical woman who was now the mistress of a large estate, believed that understanding the estate's finances was part of understanding the estate. Mrs. Ferro had produced the account books with the same slightly relieved expression that housekeepers always produced when someone finally asked to see them. The accounts were, on the whole, in order. The estate was well managed, the expenditure appropriate to the income, the tenant rentals regularly received and carefully recorded. Oliver was, by all financial evidence, a competent and attentive landowner. There was one set of entries she could not account for. They began 8 months before, in a quarterly series, each entry of the same amount, a significant sum, not ruinous but not trivial, recorded under the heading of miscellaneous professional services, with no further specification. They were paid from a separate account that she found referenced in the main ledger but could not locate the corresponding book for. They were regular. They were consistent. They were, by the measure of what else appeared in the accounts, conspicuous in their vagueness. She set a small slip of paper at the relevant page and moved on. That evening at dinner, she asked Oliver about the East Tower. She asked it in the way she asked most things, directly, without preface, after they had been sitting in silence for long enough that the silence had stopped being comfortable. She said she had noticed the tower had a window and that the window had been dark when they arrived and had continued to be dark, and she was wondering whether the tower was in use. Oliver looked at her. He said, "The tower is not in use." "What was it used for?" A pause. "It has historically been used for storage. It has not been in active use for some time. Can it be accessed from the main house? There is a staircase in the east corridor. Is it locked?" "Yes." She looked at him. "I see," she said. "I was curious because it is a structural element I haven't been able to assess. If it is simply storage, there is no urgency, but if it is being excluded from the winter maintenance schedule, it might be worth ensuring the roof is sound." He said, "I will have the roof assessed." "Thank you," she said, and returned to the soup, which was good. She said nothing else about the tower that evening. She was not, by temperament, the kind of person who pushed at a door the first time she found it locked. She was the kind of person who noted the door, assessed what she knew about it, and returned when she had more information. What she did in the following days was the thing she was best at. She listened. Mrs. Ferro, who was a careful and professional woman with the loyalty of a long-serving housekeeper, did not tell Susannah anything directly about the tower or its history. But Mrs. Ferro was also a woman who had been running this household for 14 years, and the habits of a woman who has been running a household for 14 years include certain involuntary responses to certain subjects, a slight closing of expression, a change in the quality of attention, a topic shifted with perhaps a half-second more deliberateness than the shifting of other topics. Susannah noted each of these small responses, because noting things was what she did. She noted that Mrs. Ferro's expression changed slightly when the East Corridor was mentioned. She noted that one of the older housemaids, a woman of about 40 who had clearly been at Darnwell Park since well before Mrs. Ferro's time, became quiet when Susannah mentioned the tower in passing, and then became busy with something that had not been urgent a moment before. She noted that the estate steward, Mr. Pendle, when asked in the course of an account-related conversation about the miscellaneous professional services entry, said it was a legal matter and moved immediately to the next subject. Legal, regular, the tower, the locked door. She found the document on a Thursday afternoon in the back cover of the second supplementary account book that she had finally located in the bottom drawer of the estate office bureau. It was not hidden exactly. It had been placed inside the back cover of the book, folded once, and the book had been in a drawer. It had the quality of something put somewhere that was not hidden enough to be a hiding place and not visible enough to be an ordinary filing. It was a document that someone had placed where it would not be casually encountered, but where it could be retrieved if the retriever knew what they were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. The document was a copy of a legal agreement, dated 2 years before. It was between Lord Darnwell of Darnwell Park and a Mr. Aldous Prent, described in the document as a physician. The agreement committed Lord Darnwell to a quarterly payment of the sum she had noticed in the accounts, in exchange for the provision by Mr. Prent of residential care and medical supervision for a named individual residing at Darnwell Park. The named individual was Lord Darnwell's brother, Mr. Gerald Darnwell. She sat with the document for some time. Gerald Darnwell. She had not known Oliver had a brother. It had not been mentioned in any conversation, any social introduction, any piece of correspondence she had seen or been told about. The estate's heir was a distant cousin. As she understood it, the lack of a direct male heir was part of what made Oliver's marriage a matter of some practical urgency, in the understanding of the county. A brother would have changed this calculation entirely, and his absence from it meant that the brother's existence was not, for some reason, part of the calculation. She folded the document and replaced it in the back cover and closed the book and returned it to the drawer. She went to find Oliver. He was in the library. The library had become, in the 2 weeks of their marriage, the room where they were most naturally in the same space, not by design but because they both went there and had begun, incrementally, to go there at the same time. He was reading. He set the book down when she came in. She sat in the chair across the reading table. She said, "I know about Gerald." She watched his face very carefully when she said it, because the information contained in the first 3 seconds of a person's response to an unexpected disclosure is worth more than the next 10 minutes of managed response. What she saw in those 3 seconds was not guilt and not anger. It was relief and then something more complicated than relief, and then the managed composure of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had just been told he did not have to carry it alone anymore. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "How? The supplementary account book, the document in the back cover, the quarterly payments to Mr. Prent." He looked at the table between them. He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to feel, and then he said, "Gerald has been ill since he was 19. He has periods of clarity and periods of severe disturbance. When he is well he is my brother as I knew him, and those periods have been better in the last year than they were before. When he is unwell, he requires care that I cannot provide here in the main house, and that would, if it became publicly known, affect his reputation and mine in ways that would be difficult to manage. The East Tower is quiet and separate and secure, and Mr. Prent has been with him for 2 years and is a good man and a careful physician." She sat with this. She said, "Is Gerald the practical reason?" Oliver looked at her. "Gerald is unmarried. He cannot, in his current situation, manage his own affairs. If I died without an heir, the estate would pass to a cousin who has no knowledge of Gerald's situation and no obligation to maintain the arrangements I have made for him. The arrangement requires money, and it requires the authority of the estate's principal. If I have a son, or if I have a wife who is aware of the situation and can manage it if I cannot, Gerald's position is secured." She looked at him across the table. "You married me to secure your brother's care. I married you because you asked direct questions and accepted direct answers and have the intelligence to manage a complicated situation with discretion. The reason I needed to marry was Gerald. The reason I chose you was not." She considered this for a long time. "Can I meet him?" she said. Oliver looked at her. "Gerald," she said, "can I meet him? Today has been a difficult day according to Prent's morning report. Not today when he is well, when Mr. Prent thinks it appropriate and Gerald himself is willing." Oliver was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I will speak to Prent." She nodded. She rose from the chair. "Susannah," he said. She stopped. He said, "I should have told you before the wedding. I intended to tell you in the first week. I convinced myself it was better to wait until you were settled and until I was certain you would." He stopped. "Until you were certain I would not leave," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I am practical," she said, "not cold. There is a difference. If you had told me before the wedding, I would have said yes. I said yes for the same reasons I said yes knowing none of this, because you are direct, and because you listen, and because the library is very good. Gerald does not change any of that. He makes it more complicated and more important, which is not the same as making it worse." Oliver looked at her with the expression she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to see from him, the expression of a man who has been managing alone for too long and has just understood that he might not have to. She met the master of the accounts, Mr. Prent, the following Friday. She met Gerald 3 weeks later, on a morning when the frost was on the grounds and the East Tower window, for the first time since her arrival, showed a lamp burning inside. Gerald Darnwell was 31, thin, with his brother's dark hair, and a quality of careful stillness that she recognized after a moment, as the stillness of a man who had learned to hold himself very steady, because the alternative was losing his footing. He was on that morning entirely lucid and entirely himself, and he spoke to her with a directness that she recognized as a family trait, and that she found, as she found it in Oliver, the easiest and most trustworthy of all the qualities a person could have. He said at the end of the visit that he was glad Oliver had married someone who was not an idiot. She said she was glad to hear it, as she had been somewhat uncertain how the assessment would go. Gerald smiled, which was the first smile she had seen in that room, and it was a good smile, and it was, in certain particulars, very like his brother's. The quarterly payments to Mr. Prent continued. The miscellaneous professional services entry no longer required a separate account. Susannah had reorganized the books so that the arrangement was documented clearly and completely, in a form that would be comprehensible to any competent executor if it became necessary, and had written a private letter of instruction to her own solicitor that sat in the estate safe alongside the legal agreement she had found in the back cover. Oliver found this out in March, when he looked at the reorganized account books for the first time. He came to find her in the library. He stood at the far end of the table with the account book in his hand and looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back. He said, "You have documented everything." "Yes, in a form that protects Gerald regardless of what happens to either of us." "Yes." He set the book down on the table. He came around the table. He sat in the chair beside her rather than across from her, which was not where he usually sat, and it was close enough that she was aware of it in the way that proximity becomes awareness when it has not previously been the custom. He said, "Thank you." It was a practical gap, she said. It needed filling. "Susannah." She looked at him. He said, "I am aware that I married you under circumstances that were not entirely fair to you, and that I have been, in the months since, considerably slower than I should have been in moving from the arrangement we agreed to the marriage I would like it to be. I am telling you this because I would rather tell you than continue the current situation, which is sustainable but is not, which is not what I want." She looked at him in the library in the March light, at the man she had been married to for 5 months and had been understanding incrementally for all of them. "What do you want?" she said. He said in the direct way she had trusted since the first conversation in the vicarage, to be married to you in the full sense, to stop being at a careful distance, to be, he paused, to be your husband as opposed to the man you share a house with who is technically your husband. She considered this. "That is," she said, "the most cautiously phrased declaration I have ever heard." Something moved in his expression. "I have been practicing it for 3 weeks, he said, "and this is the best I could do." She said it was sufficient. The library in March was the same library it had always been, the Stillingfleet and the Pearsons still in the 17th century theology section, the barrow now beside them where it belonged, the same long reading table and the same morning light from the tall windows and the same good dusty smell. It was sufficient for what came next, which was the beginning of the marriage she had said yes to without knowing it, on a rainy October morning in a vicarage parlour, when a man had given her direct answers, and she had decided, practically and correctly, to trust them.